One moment. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural International Society for Quality of Life Studies, better known as ISQOLS, President's Lecture. My name is Jill Johnson, and I am the Executive Director for ISQOLS. We're very pleased to have all of you joining us today. Feel free to write in the chat bar where you're joining us from. We'd love to see people from around the world tuning in. Before we begin the webinar, I just want to remind everyone that this is being recorded. Please do make sure that your microphones are muted. And in the interest of preserving bandwidth, we ask that you actually turn off your cameras during the presentation. We will have time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers where everyone can turn on their cameras and have a great discussion. But during the presentation, please turn off your cameras. We will be sending the recording via email afterwards. So if you have to hop off, don't worry, you'll see the full thing. Along with that recording, we will actually be also sending an invitation for anyone who is not a current member, an invitation for a 3-month free trial membership to ISQOLS. So we hope that you take advantage of that opportunity. We also invite you to consider attending our upcoming in-person conference in Burlington, Vermont, USA, coming up in August 3rd through the 6th. We'll send you more details about that as well via email. With that, I'll go ahead and turn this over to Kelsey O'Connor from our executive committee to introduce Dr. Carol Graham. Kelsey?
Yes, thanks very much, Jill. So yeah, I wanted to say just a few more words before we introduce Carol. So first off, I'm Kelsey O'Connor. So I am one of ISQOLS vice presidents. I'm on the executive committee. And I wanted to say, we're pleased to welcome you to this inaugural President's Lecture by Carol Graham. As the name implies, today's lecture will be the first in a series of lectures. The series will allow ISQOLS presidents to share their insights with the community and for us to get to know them a little better. It represents one of ISQOLS' new initiatives. Some expand the activities beyond the conference, such as webinars and the members' discussion forum. We also collaborate with other organizations, such as the Community Indicators Consortium, Erasmus Happiness Economics Research Organization, and the Global Labor Organization, just as a couple to mention. And indeed, the latter two co-organized special sessions on happiness economics at our annual conference they have since 2019. So ISQOLS is continuing to develop, and we generally want to hear from you. So if you want to collaborate, please consider using the forum, giving a webinar, or organizing something more substantial. And in order to do that, you can contact Jill, you can contact me, or other members of the board. You'll see the email afterwards from Jill with our contact information. But back to today's event. So I think many of you know Dr. Carol Graham. That's why you're here. But to say a few more words, to provide some of her background, she has quite a prestigious list of achievements. And first off, she is the Leo Pasvolsky Senior Fellow at Brookings Institution. She is a College Park professor at the University of Maryland and a senior scientist at Gallup. She served on the National Academy of Sciences panel on well-being metrics for policy in 2012 through 13. She received a Pioneer Awards from the Robert Woods Johnson Foundation in 2017, 2021, and a Lifetime Distinguished Scholar Award from the International Society of Quality of Life Studies in 2018. From 2002 to 2004, she served as vice president at Brookings. She's also served as special advisor to the vice president of the Inter-American Development Bank, as a visiting fellow in the office of the chief economist of the World Bank, and a consultant to the International Monetary Fund and the Harvard Institute for International Development. She's the author of numerous books and articles. Her most recent book she'll be talking about today. You'll hear a little bit more of that soon. She's also published articles, of course, in a range of prestigious journals, and there are too many to list now. She's the senior editor at Behavioral Science and Policy, senior editor at Behavioral Science and Policy, and an associate editor of the Journal of Economic Behavior Organization. She has an AB from Princeton University, an MA from Johns Hopkins, a D.Phil from Oxford, and is the mother of 3 beautiful children. And of course, she's the president of ISQOLS. So, excuse me. So with that, Jill and Carol, I will pass it back over to Carol, and please get started. Thank you very much for being here with us today.
So Kelsey, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. Actually, Kelsey is co-author on one of my best articles, which you'll hear a little bit about in the course of this presentation. So what I'm hoping to do today is one, not disappoint you, as you give an inaugural lecture. It's supposed to be important, but I'm really trying to push the boundaries a bit and think about hope as a dimension in well-being that we've started to take a stab at, but we really don't know. And the more I know about it, both through survey research and through some experimental, through large N survey data, but also through some experimental surveys, is that it matters a lot to people's futures, right? That hope is very distinct from optimism, where you sort of think things will get better because you're a natural optimism, which is a great optimist, which is a great thing to be. But hope really combines sort of thinking things will get better with believing you can make them better. So it has an agency quality that really results in better long-term outcomes. I'm going to show you some examples. And the opposite of it is worse, which is people in despair without hope tend to do very badly, and they often die early. And in the US, it really rings true because we have a crisis of deaths of despair, with over 1 million people since roughly 2005 dying of premature preventable deaths due to suicide, alcohol poisoning, and overdose. And most recently, overdose deaths have increased dramatically in 2019 and 2020. And I'm sorry to see some new data from my home country, Peru, where we find that suicides have increased. Peru was the country in the world with the highest levels of stress during COVID. They really got hit hard, in part because the government didn't do a great job of managing the pandemic, but it did a lot better job than, say, Bolsonaro in Brazil and many, many other countries. I would argue they did a better job than Trump did, for sure, in the United States. But because of the conditions there, because of crowded urban settings, all sorts of things, I think a weak public health system, they were hit really hard by COVID, and they displayed the highest levels of stress during the pandemic, and now have a really big increase in suicide, particularly among younger women. So we don't really know yet why, or enough about the demographics to be able to pin another cause to it. But suicide is sort of the ultimate lack of hope measure. And so I want to talk a little bit about one, the approach, how we measure it, not just hope, but other well-being metrics most of you know, but for those of you who come from different disciplines, at least how we measure well-being in economics. And then try and talk about some properties that hope has and some of the results that I think make a case for why we should take it more seriously and why we should take it, governments should include it in their measures of well-being to the extent they have them. Again, the US tends to lag behind on these things. Let me see. Can't seem to. Okay, here we go. All right. So just a couple words about the metrics and the science. I think, many of us today take it for granted that governments might be measuring well-being, that there are countries like New Zealand and the UK that really include well-being, not just in their metrics, but as they think about policies. The Canadians are starting to, other countries are. And we also, I think, take it for granted that there's part of the economic discipline that focuses on well-being, and the same in other disciplines, psychology as well. And yet, when I started in this in around the year 2000, people laughed at us, right? Particularly economists. You work on what? At the time, we really only worked on happiness because that's what we had in the surveys that we had. We didn't think about these different dimensions that we now know about. We didn't think about causality, all the things we're doing now, which we take for granted and have become much more sophisticated, were hardly even imaginable. And then enter COVID, which is a horrible thing, but I think it opened the door in a way to our field in the sense of really showing that for the world as a whole, things like quality of life and mental health mattered a lot. In fact, they mattered, that they could be destroyed by something like a pandemic, and that we could have crises of mental health and ill-being in a way on a scale we hadn't imagined. And so then the tools that we've developed become there and again much more useful, not just in academic disciplines, but also in policy. And we're even lucky enough to now have societies like a society like ISQOLS that's focused on well-being and quality of life, special journals like ARQLS, the Journal of Happiness Studies, International Journal for Happiness and Development, which I think help us, push the envelope a little bit. I think it's important that we also publish in mainstream journals, because that's in a way what most gets the approach further, the well-being measurement approach. But I think it's also the field journals make a big difference, and they give a lot more opportunity to publish and exchange findings. So I 20 years after getting this into this exercise, I can't believe, where it is. And so I think that's a good thing. I mean, when I first went to ISQOLS, probably in about 2010, I mean, it was just kind of this teeny, it was fun, it was like a nice group of people, but we didn't, it wasn't 400 people with countries, all, from people from countries all over the world and lots of different disciplines. So again, I'm just really happy about where we are. And I think I'm thrilled that all of you are involved in this. And one of the things that we're also now seeing is this whole idea that the well-being metrics can play an important role in policy and in measurement and in statistics. And so most countries already have publicly available well-being data in their national statistics. The US is just starting, only because of COVID, and they're doing the measures all wrong, and they're not following the OECD guidelines that we worked so hard on for best measurement practice. But it's still progress. It's just the US is going to do things its own way, as we know. Anyway, I think that once you get the data into official statistics, there's a big step, because it becomes part of a language of a measurement science upon which policy and policy debates are grounded. And so that's a really important change. So I'm thrilled to see it slowly starting in the US. And then just two other points I think that are worth thinking about in terms of why we should measure well-being is, one is that they're particularly useful tools for answering questions that standard revealed preferences approaches don't answer very well. So take mainstream economics, for example. You only believe what people do, not what people say. And you look at consumption choices as, something that they've chosen to do within a fixed budget constraint that represents a rational choice. And so that's the kind of data that you should focus on. But we know that people do really dumb things. They buy things they don't want. They buy things that they think will make them happy, and they don't make them happy. And then there are also people who have addiction and self-control problems, and they're consuming not because necessarily those are optimal rational choices, but because of, addiction to drugs or whatever it might be. And then finally, there are people that don't have the agency to make choices. Like they don't have the money to make the choices they want to make. And it isn't just in terms of what they buy, but it's in terms of what they do. Do they send their children to school or not? All sorts of things. So they really help us in terms of answering questions that other approaches don't answer very well. And then until now, we've measured three key dimensions of well-being. The most common is evaluative, cognitive assessments of life satisfaction, and also I think hope falls in there now. We also have hedonic well-being, which is mood and affect during daily activities, such as smiling or being stressed. And in fact, good measurement of those kinds of things are one of the things that got Danny Kahneman the Nobel Prize. He pioneered some of the tracking metrics that we can use to measure mood and affect. And then finally, we measure eudaimonic well-being, which is purpose and meaning in life. I've found that it tracks very closely with life satisfaction, but it does have some different it displays some different qualities. I think it's a really important dimension of well-being. And I think hope should be a distinct dimension because, as I mentioned before, of its links to future behavior. And I'm going to speak a little bit more about them. In general, my research over at least a decade has been exploring how unequal distributions of income, well-being, and hope are a barrier to our prosperity. And we find that hope for the future is strongly associated with better long-term outcomes. And one of the journal articles that I'll talk about is the one Kelsey and I did together. Quick one slide on the what we do, at least in terms of econometrics. Again, there are plenty of people that take different approaches. Psychologists tend to take different approaches, but in economics, again, most of you know this, but in case you don't, I mean, the most important thing about this slide is that we aren't asking people if particular things make them happy or unhappy, right? We're not surveying people and saying, does unemployment make you unhappy? We're collecting well-being data, and then we collect a whole bunch of other data on individuals, and we see the relationship between the two of them. But people themselves aren't making the choice, or they're not answering what makes them happy and what makes them unhappy, which I think allows for a robust analysis. And also because we find very consistent patterns in the determinants of life satisfaction around the world, health, employment, income, social relationships, and marriage, or partnerships. And again, there's a direction of causality problem because happier people are much more likely to marry each other. I can talk more about that, but I don't have that much time, but I'm certainly happy to when we have a discussion. Once we know what those consistent patterns are, then we explore the happiness effects of things that vary or change more, such as inflation, unemployment rates, inequality, environmental quality, commuting time, and this sort of the world is our oyster. Okay, so one thing there's some debate, and I've found it to be pretty consistent in a lot of countries using Gallup data, also using other data sets. But the reason to put this up is not because of that, but what we are finding is that in the low of the U curve, sort of in the low of midlife well-being, we find that that's around the same time frame where despair tends to be the highest. Now, there's a new pattern in youth suicide, but for the most part, the deaths of despair that I've talked about are concentrated in the midlife years. So also, I think there's a hump in other things like suicides, antidepressant use, stress. So there's around the same age. And so why is that age stressful, and does it lead to more despair? I think, there are lots of reasons, many of which I think are well known. But I think one of the things that we find that's relevant to this is that people who have hope, who believe things will get better, tend to then live much longer. And at the top of the U, you're seeing that they're very old people are very happy, and it doesn't seem to make sense. But there's a selection bias because people live much longer. Right, so you have a very small sample of happier people. But again, a reason to try and understand hope a little better and why people have it, why they don't, and can it be reinstilled in populations and in people that have lost it? And that's an open question. Okay, so back to why well-being metrics matter and hope in particular. The work I've been doing on deaths of despair very much points to hope or lack of hope as the most important factor. Obviously, there are economic and other reasons why people are in despair, but the metric that stands out the most tends to be lack of hope. So when I got into this, one of the things that surprised me in about 2015 is that the well-being of the poor and the rich, the gap in well-being, is much greater in the US than in Latin America. I mean, major differences. And when I first found that, I was quite surprised. And I'd been thinking that something was going on in the US. I work a lot in Latin America, which is, there's a lot of poverty, but it's a pretty cheerful place in the end. And I would come back from Latin America from any amount of numerous trips and wonder, what is it about being poor that's so depressing in the US? I mean, one of the things is that it's hard to be poor in a rich land, right? But there's much more to that. I think one of the big things is that in the US, because of this, very strong belief that we're a meritocracy, and if you work hard, you get ahead. If you don't get ahead, if you fall behind, there's some stigma associated, and we don't have good safety nets to support people that fall behind, because in a way, the presumption, not among everybody, but among some people, is if you didn't make it, it's your fault. That's really not a good way to manage a society. And in particular, one of the things that's happening, we know it's happening around the world, is that technology-driven growth and other factors for sure are making it much harder for people at the low wage end of the scale to do well, right? Because of their skills, because of the nature of low skill jobs, they're getting scarcer and they're getting to be of lower quality. In the US, I looked at some data recently, and the gap between job quality and whether or not you have health insurance is huge, right? So most of the jobs in the gig economy, in the service sectors, don't come with health insurance, for example, and other benefits attached. So I would say we're the only rich country in the world where if you lose your job, you lose your health insurance. So if you're already in bad straits, it's a ticket for disaster, not just for you, but for your family. And big surprise then that's also associated with despair. One of the things that we find, though, is that despair, which is essentially lack of hope, you've given up a reason for living, it's also linked to poor markers of objective health, high levels of reported pain, opioid addiction, and labor force dropout. And labor force dropout is different from unemployment. It's worse. It means you've given up looking for a job, right? And so even pre-COVID, when we were boasting about record low levels of unemployment, 4%, 20% of prime age males were out of the labor force. Out of the labor force, again, means they've dropped out. They're not looking for a job. They're no longer in the ratio upon which the standard unemployment rate is calculated. So in a way, they become, in the words of a sergeant in MASH who told Hawkeye that he was dead, even though he wasn't dead. He said, well, they say you're dead. So, basically you're an unperson. Well, if you drop out of the labor force, you become an unperson, right? You aren't even counted in the statistics anymore. And so what we find is that those people are in high levels of despair, and they have not only dropped out of the labor force, they've sort of dropped out of life. And we have large swaths of communities where those people are concentrated. And it's not a surprise that they are highly represented in deaths of despair, and that their communities suffer from more general despair. And I can't prove the direction of causality. Does living in a depressed community make it more likely that you will commit suicide? I don't know, but I can't imagine it's a positive plus, right? And if you're living in one of those communities, there aren't a lot of jobs, there are no opportunities, and it's very difficult to move to a vibrant, urban center on the East Coast or West Coast of the country. There's expense, there's skill differences, and in a way, there are cultural differences. We become a very divided society. So the other side of all this story, which is pretty depressing, is understanding hope. And the question I've been thinking a lot about is, how does hope affect future outcomes? And so I find that people who believe in their futures are much more likely to invest in them. And I did do these surveys of low-income young adults in the US and find that those with higher levels of hope are more likely to believe in and achieve higher education. So I not only tested their beliefs, but their actual achievements after. and to avoid risky behaviors like unsafe sex or drugs that jeopardize their health. And I did these surveys in Missouri, the heartland of the country, bordering, Missouri's got every problem the US can imagine, and it borders 7 other states. So I can't say it's a representative state, but it's certainly in the middle of the country. And one of the things that I found I knew about from the large N data, but I really was struck as I read the survey responses. We had to do mail-in survey because of COVID. We'd planned to do in-person surveying, was the very low education aspirations among white respondents compared to Black ones, right? So the white kids basically did not want to go to school beyond high school, maybe a year of vocational school. And they had no vision for the future, that they could have a better future. It was very clear in their answers. And the other thing that I thought, or that struck me and made me more upset, was that their parents didn't want them to go to college. I mean, they actively did not support them going to college. We aren't talking about financing college. It's just, did they support them in higher education aspirations? And the answer was very clearly no. And this isn't one outlier result. This is most of the white kids. Meanwhile, the Black respondents, who were materially more deprived, they were both low-income groups, were much more likely to believe and want to go to college. And they almost all had a mentor, a person in their family, a grandmother, somebody that supported them in their education aspirations. Again, those aspirations are going to be hard. It's not easy to make it to college and finish if you come from a low-income background in the US. It's become increasingly hard over time, as Ross Shetty has showed. But it's really, really interesting that the belief in the value of higher education is strong among minorities and pretty much non-existent among low-income whites. And I can get into that more later, but among other things, it really highlights our ideological divides, and including kind of a lack of belief in science having become politicized. But I think understanding these dynamics and why hope matters, I mean, if you want to be like a hard-nosed Washington policymaker, you want to understand why people aren't taking up your incentives, right? Why don't people seek out better healthcare and insurance? Why don't people take up opportunities to move, the option to move to opportunity when offered? Well, if you don't understand sort of the well-being dynamics that underlie people's decisions, some of them are psychological and some are just, lack of incentive, from within, that you're not going to understand why policies succeed or fail. And one of the things I've found with the desperate white men out of the labor force, they're the worst off group, was that they wouldn't move to opportunity if it was next door, right? They just had no aspirations. And their health was also bad, and often they had high levels of drug addiction. So how could they move to opportunity, right? So you sort of have to understand the roots of their problems before you think, you think that a policy solution is going to work. Okay, very, very, let's see what time it is. Okay, quickly, this is just a finding that I got again in 2015, and I was quite surprised by it. And since it shows up again and again and again, most recently in those education surveys, that of low-income groups in the United States, African Americans are the most optimistic group by far. And we even find that holds during COVID, when they were the worst hit by COVID, and they still maintain optimism, although they increased in their levels of stress and anxiety. Hispanics are also optimistic, not a surprise. As I mentioned, Latin America is a pretty cheerful place. But again, this is contrasted with poor whites, and we see that they're the least optimistic group. And that again shows up over and over again. And so if you look at, this is Kelsey's slide actually, if you look at the deaths of despair, okay, this is the US compared to 6 other rich countries. The red line is US whites, and the dark blue line in the middle is US Hispanics. It's actually a Case and Deaton slide adapted by Kelsey to be accurate. But what you can see is mortality. This is all-cause mortality for ages 45 to 54-year-olds. And what we see is that US whites are going up. The rest of the graph, including US Hispanics, is going down. If we had African Americans on that chart, they would be with US Hispanics. So they started from a higher level of mortality, both Hispanics and African Americans and US whites, and yet they've been going down at a rate. They've been very much narrowing the gap in longevity between whites and minorities. 2019 and 2020 are slightly different, but I will talk about that in a second. Here is just kind of one snapshot of the COVID shock. These are opioid overdoses from EMS data, which is emergency response data, because we only now have the 2020 CDC data. But when we did this slide, CDC data lags about a year, 2 years long before it releases the final mortality rates for a year. So we put this together in 2021. But what we find that the big yellow line is overdose rates for 2019 to 2020. And as you can see, they're very, very large, the change during COVID. And since then, the CDC data is out, and we had 93,000 overdose deaths in 2020, compared to about 70,000 in 2019. So a very big increase in opioid overdoses. I can't say COVID is the only cause. I mean, who knows? But it's a pretty stark line. Rather surprisingly, in 2020, suicides in the U.S. were lower than they were in 2019, very slightly. But if you look at the overdose line, we don't know how many of those overdoses were intentional or not. This is a bit morbid, but if people don't leave a note, there's no way of knowing. And so the coroner is going to code it as an overdose death. About the estimates vary from 15 to 60% of overdose deaths being intentional. So, it's just really hard to make, I would say, perfect comments about any of these data, but the trajectory in 2020 and 2021 has not been good for despair. And here's just very quickly to show you that even during COVID, let's look at the left slide, and you just see optimism. These are people optimistic about their life in 5 years? And you get Blacks, low-income Blacks being by far the most optimistic group, with a few, downward dips during the waves of the pandemic, but really not much. And then they are also the least likely to report stress. So again, this minority optimism finding doesn't seem to go away, even with big challenges. So again, let's go back to hope, because we're spending a lot of time on despair and suicide, which is depressing, although it's a reality. So I really think that hope is the dimension that's most linked to future behavior and has agentic properties. As Amanda Gorman says, it's not just a belief that things can get better, but that we can make things better, right? There are things that people can do. And so it's distinct from moral optimism. Arthur Brooks makes a distinction between the tragic optimist versus the hopeful pessimist, right? We know people who are sort of Pollyannas, and they often think things will get better regardless. But that's very different from the hopeful pessimist who knows things are bad, but still thinks that things can change. And one of the things I tested from very early on with my optimistic low-income African-American respondents were they Pollyannas, right? Were they hopeful because had they no other choice, like many very poor people around the world? And what I found is that wasn't the case at all, that they were optimistic about the future, but they said their financial situation was bad. They were not satisfied with the city they lived in, all sorts of other markers. And yet they're also much more likely than other racial groups to want to give back to their communities. So there's something, I would say, that it's not really just an optimism finding, it's a hope finding. And as I mentioned, the opposite of hope is despair. And it's really it's really becoming, at least in the US, a social crisis. It's not only a health issue, but it's become, in the US, a threat to our civil society and democracy. We find that people who are desperate, there's a whole neurological literature on this, that people in despair are much more vulnerable to conspiracy theories and right-wing radicalization. And one of the things I looked at in this process was a description of the people that participated in the January 6th storming of the US Capitol. Now, granted, that's a select small group, and I'm not talking about it being a robust scientific finding, but the profiles of these people were very similar to the profiles of people in despair. They tended to have had money. They weren't poor necessarily, or they didn't start poor, but they'd run into financial trouble. They were often isolated from their families. They didn't have, purpose in life. They weren't, they had nothing to lose, essentially. So they stormed the Capitol because Trump said to do it. Well, anybody with a family and a purpose and maybe a little bit less vulnerable would have said, you've got to be kidding, right? But there were a lot of people perfectly willing to do something crazy and seemed sort of blind to the fact that they might get in trouble. Anyway, so then the other thing is psychiatrists who admit that hope is understudied note that restoring hope is a critical element in recovering from mental illness because it restores the individual agency that people with mental health have lost. So again, another reason why hope, I think, is a distinct dimension of well-being. It is different from life satisfaction. And interestingly enough, hope is a trait. It isn't just, sort of there is a hereditary part to it. Like all of well-being, there's a genetic component, but it's also something that can be developed and learned. And Jim Heckman and colleagues have done really, really interesting work on socio-emotional skills and on the big 5 personality traits, which show that people develop these skills or can develop these skills much later in life than IQ or cognitive skills, which by the time you're in your late 20s, you're sort of stuck. I don't mean that pessimistically, but you develop other kinds of wisdom, emotional wisdom, experience, but your IQ becomes pretty much set by the time you're in your late 20s. And the other thing that we find is lack of hope is linked to a range of later life mental health issues and lower life expectancy, as Kelsey and I have written about. Really quickly, because I want to leave some time for questions. This survey, I talked a little bit about it, but we started in Peru, where we were able to both interview in person just before COVID hit, was the second wave, in a poor neighborhood in Peru. And we found a big peri-urban neighborhood. We had 400 people. 80% of these kids, 17 to 8-year-old adolescents, aspire to college or postgraduate education. Not a single one of their parents had college education. They live in a neighborhood. It used to be all dirt roads and no water, no electricity. Now about half of it has pavement, half of it has water and electricity, half of it is still dirt roads, and they buy water from trucks and tap into electricity. And yet these kids think they're going to go to college or postgraduate. And you can say, how can that be in a poor country like Peru? Well, Peru, unlike the US, has actually a pretty widespread public health system, public education system. Peruvians value education a lot. And when we interviewed them 3 years later, almost all of our high aspiration kids were on track to meet their goals, which is pretty remarkable, like 90% of them. And the other thing that, again, that sort of resonates with the white versus black findings in the US is that even though their parents had not gone to college, they were very strongly supportive of their kids' education aspirations. So it's a whole complex story about why some people are hopeful and why they're not. But I think, it really is going to matter. And I think it's going to matter the most to this next generation. In the US, I worry a lot about low income, low education cohorts, young cohorts that don't understand that the labor force is going to be even more stacked against them in the future than it is now. And they don't have to go to college. I don't think a college education is the only way to go, but they need to educate beyond a not so good public high school education, because the kinds of skills that are going to be necessary in the next, the labor forces of the future are very different from the ones that they have acquired and that their parents have, right? And so the most, I suppose, the newest part of my research, and Catalina, who's on the call at Civic Wellbeing Partners, is one partner in trying to understand this, is Can Hope Be Learned or Restored, where it has been lost. I talk a lot in the new book, which is called Hope and Despair, very simply, out with Princeton Press in a couple of months. I think, there are many kinds of well-being based interventions. There are also increasing numbers of mental health interventions that involve communities, that aren't just, you don't just plunk a policy in place, but you think a lot about the people that can support these. You think a lot about peer mentors, the role of communities in supporting change for the better, whether it's in mental health or in increasing well-being or hope. And one of the things that Civic Wellbeing Partners does, which is very really exciting, is that they sponsor microgrants to low-income people, mainly minorities, who are trying to somehow improve the well-being and the opportunities of their communities. And you should reach out to her and Julie Rusk if you want to know more. But the point is, there are things out there we can do. They're just not what we think about, right? They're not moving to opportunity. When people aren't going to move, then moving to opportunity won't work. You need to focus on where people are now, and particularly people in despair who are not going to change on their own and take up incentives to a new standard policy, right? The community is going to matter. So I'm going to stop so that I don't use up all the time, but I do want to also sort of put in a plug for the newest sort of wave of well-being research. We have some really cool young economists joining and who have joined ISQOLS and who have become well-being scholars. There's a big collection of them at Oxford. There are others. There's some in the Netherlands at Erasmus University. Martijn Berger obviously is from there, the next president of ISQOLS. And we have lots of exciting research now in terms of the causal properties of well-being, new methods, things like twin studies. I wrote the first paper on could higher levels of life satisfaction lead to higher incomes in 2004. At the time, everybody laughed at me. They said it was measurement error, all sorts of things. Angus Deaton told me it was measurement error, by the way. But it turns out it's now my most cited paper quite a long time later. And then most recently, Kelsey and I have a paper on optimists living longer based on panel data for the US. Just another example of why hope matters. And again, we also have, I think it matters for our field, but it's starting to matter for societies. Certainly the US is a poster child for why lack of hope matters a lot, but I think other societies are facing some similar problems. So I will stop there and hope there's some questions. And I think Kelsey's gonna manage that.
Thank you, Carol, very much for this great introduction to the field, and also your very kind comments towards me. Much appreciated. So everyone, what I would like you to do is to write in the chat. We have a short period of time, and so write in the chat. What I'll do is I'll read it out for Carol so that it also gets into the recording. So please feel free to go there now. We had one question during the talk from Talita, who is asking about the correlation between hope and optimism. Rhonda Phillips, and it was Talita Grayling, Rhonda Phillips' response, maybe feelings versus beliefs. So they're commenting to the same thing. So maybe Carol, you can respond to that.
Well, Rhonda answered it for me. But it is a good question. And I can't say I knew that difference, Talita, before I got into this. But one of the things why I think we should, if we're going to think about hope seriously, if we're going to think about it as another dimension of well-being that we care about, I think we should focus on hope and not just optimism, although optimism is certainly a part of it, and that it goes beyond beliefs and beyond feelings to real beliefs that you can make things better. And it turns out in the empirical data that those beliefs actually, at least my little subset of data, which isn't that big, but there's some other studies as well, would show that hopeful people actually act to make their futures better, and as a result they have better futures, right? So I would say that they're correlated, but there's a difference.
Thanks. And two related questions, actually. So Susan Schuster asked, how is hope defined? And I know you covered part of that. And Milena Nikolova asks, is hope hedonic or eudaimonic dimension of well-being? So kind of related questions here.
Okay. So hope is defined, lots of different definitions. I think the simplest is that the belief that things will get better if you do something about it, right? So it's not just the belief that things will get better, although that matters a lot, but that it's linked to associated behaviors and understanding that things will get better only if you do things about them. You can't just sit and wait for them to get better. And Milena, hi, I wish I could see you and your beautiful new baby. So I think hope is very much more evaluative or eudaimonic in nature than hedonic. I think hopeful people probably have better hedonic experiences throughout their life, right? Because they're much more resilient to negative shocks. And so stress and other things that are natural parts of life are less likely to get them down. But I think it's linked to the sort of evaluative, cognitive part of well-being, and that translates into agency.
Agency is, important, as I've understood from working with you in the past. So we have a question from H.M. Ayakawa and asking about the survey instrument. So I'm guessing that's a particular question. And I know it differs across surveys. And then the second question is there a correlation between hope and religion among Black Americans in particular?
Okay, both good questions. The survey instrument is a very long survey called Thinking About the Future. If you send me an email to cgraham@brookings.edu, I'm happy to send you a copy of it. It's a big survey. So we covered the ground in terms of adolescent behavior, in terms of many definitions of hope, in terms of the role of peers, in terms of the role of mentors, all sorts of things. But I'm happy to send that to you. And in terms of religion, I have thought a lot about religion, and I've thought a lot about even the nature of Latin American and African American religions and the role of communities in those versus evangelicals, which more low-income whites are disproportionately represented in the evangelical branch of Protestantism in the US. And one thing about those two that's very distinct, or the two kinds of religions, is that evangelicals emphasize the individual relationship with God versus Latin Americans and African Americans think about religion as a community thing, right? It's part and parcel of the communities that support them that make their hope and optimism possible. One of the reasons for that isn't religion. It is that these communities, which I call communities of empathy, were formed by minorities because they knew the American system wasn't just. They knew that it wasn't all about you work hard, you get ahead. It's all, the American dream, which whites bought hook, line, and sinker because for a long time it worked for them and they had privileged access to all the good jobs. I sound cynical, but unfortunately, their privilege turned out to be a bad thing in the long run. Another ironic part of the story is that because minorities tend to be discriminated against in our health system, they were much less likely to be prescribed opioids if they had pain. And guess what? They're much more likely to die of deaths of despair related to opioids because they were much less likely to get hooked on them. Now, fentanyl has changed that equation a little bit, but so back to religion, I think the communal nature of religions matters in this story. In my regret, this sounds very econometric and weird, but I did not want religion to be driving the findings, because that would just be a very different kind of finding, and one that I would not necessarily be comfortable with in terms of scientific research. So I controlled for religion in my regressions. African Americans are the most likely racial cohort to say that religion is important in their lives of all the racial cohorts in the United States. So I know our findings are not driven by something observable in terms of people's expressed religious beliefs. I think they're unobservable spillover effects of religion, like the sense of community, that we can't control for in regressions and are very much part of the story. So sorry about the long answer, but it's a complicated one.
No, that's great, Carol. Next question is from Emma Pleeging. Consumer confidence appears to be a better predictor of behavior than models based on objective measures during times of crises. Do you think the same would apply to hope? How do you think current feelings of pessimism might affect our behavior?
Well, that's a great question. And I've also read your work on hope, Emma, which is very good. So I think, I think our models in 2009, when there was a financial crisis we didn't explain, completely ignored psychology and contagion effects and human sentiment in driving big moves in economic behavior. And I think the same is true today. We're in a very weird time in terms of what's going on with economies around the world, with the war in Ukraine, and high levels of inflation everywhere. People, the Great Resignation, people really recalibrating their lives, and do they want to be in the labor force the same way they were before? So I don't think we know where it will all land, but if we don't attempt to understand human psychology and human hope and everything else as part of the process, we're going to be very far off in our predictions. We still may be off in our predictions, but I think that that's very clearly demonstrated that the original traditional models just failed huge numbers of people badly in the Great Recession of 2009. And indeed, I think also opened another door to the importance of well-being research.
Thank you.
We're benefiting from all these tragedies. It's not fair, but
learning from, right?
Right.
It's a learning opportunity.
Better put.
So from Eduardo Betacat, you mostly focus on personal hope or optimism. How does this personal hope or optimism relate to social or societal hope and optimism?
I'm convinced it does. I know a lot more about communities in despair than I know about sort of how you create hopeful communities. I'm trying to learn about that. The lessons we have are in stories of minority communities, right? That are what I call communities of empathy, where if you fall behind, you have a community you can fall back on, where you aren't seen as a loser, where you're not stigmatized. And I think that comes from groups that have had somebody in their family have problems, that have had the system be unjust, that have, they've had to cope, and they're much more resilient. And so entire communities are much more hopeful and resilient, or some communities than others. And what we find in the very fractured communities of despair is that the sense of community has been lost, along with the sense of hope. And I don't I don't know the direction of causality there, right? Can a hopeful person succeed in a community filled with despair? Can a hopeful person change things in a community filled with despair? Or do the communities that are hopeful make it easier for people to recover from despair? I have a feeling it's two-way causality, and that trying to prove which direction it runs in is less important than just understanding the role that it plays. So again, that's not an easy question to answer. It's a great question, and I've certainly thought about it, but I don't have all the answers.
Okay, that makes sense though. So we have a question from Dr. Parviz Dabir Alai. I think you know him. I may be pronouncing his name incorrectly though. What I really like about Carol's approach is that it brings together several key elements of what really matters to this field. For example, there is some discussion of vulnerability mixed in with the discussion, but vulnerability has numerous dimensions too. How do we go about measuring vulnerability? Surely it has to be multidimensional. Is that your view too? Anyway, a great talk and a pleasure to hear you as always.
Well, thank you, Parviz, and that's a really great question. And I can't answer any of these questions. I'm terrible, but we are working on it. We're working on a very distinct dimension of vulnerability, which is we are building an indicator in the US on communities that are more vulnerable, people and places that are more vulnerable to misinformation about science. In particular, my partners are two medical doctors who are obviously worried about vaccine skepticism and other things. But part and parcel of that story, and part and parcel of what we're measuring, is levels of despair. Because as I noted, there's a whole new body of neurological research that suggests that people in despair are more vulnerable to conspiracy theories, to radicalization. And if you think about it, it's not rocket science, right? If you have nothing to lose, which is what people in despair, that's the state they're in, right? They don't care if they live or die. So why not storm the Capitol? Why not join a radical movement? Again, you see that profile repeating itself in earlier kinds of rebellions, like the people that flew planes into the Pentagon, right? They were, things as they were sort of unacceptable, and they didn't see a way to change them. So they were very easily radicalized, right? So I think, I don't know, that's really not a good definition of vulnerability. I feel like we have a good definition of despair, and we know that people in despair are more vulnerable to certain things. But what's the definition of vulnerability? I should think about that more. It's a great question.
Okay, great. There are a few thank yous I just want to take note of for you here. So there's one from Eileen Avery. You have also received one from Milena Nikolova. She apologized, she had to run. The same with Francesco Saracino. Rhonda Phillips has also said thank you. So just a few there. But then we'll get back to the questions. Yeah, just a couple more, everyone. We have to leave. And so Martijn Hendricks was next. So do you believe subjective well-being and hope should get a more central role in national well-being dashboards and objective well-being dimension dimensions, say financial situation, the environment, et cetera, play a smaller role?
Yeah, because I had to sort of develop this approach amidst very skeptical economists and convince them that you could even believe what was in survey data. I think that sort of less is better with any of these things, and that if we focus on, for example, the ONS4, which are four key dimensions of, well, there are three key dimensions of well-being. There's a negative and positive question for hedonic. I think those have been quite successful and making their way into the UK Treasury, into the Green Book, into all sorts of their now well-being is actually an objective of the UK's leveling up effort. So I feel as though the more we can make well-being metrics become part and parcel of existing statistics versus new dashboards and new, I tend to think they will have longer term, kind of longer term impact. I think often these new dashboards take the HDI, the HDI metric, take the kind of the attempts, very well intentioned, to develop new kinds of progress indicators as separate indicators. I think precisely because they're separate indicators, they kind of go and come. They're sort of fads. Versus if you manage to get the metrics into official statistics collection, there they are. They're part and parcel of the things we regularly use. Again, I wish we could do more and say it would work. Again, I'm come from a very skeptical environment, which is the US, right? Which has been much more reluctant to take on well-being as an important approach than other societies. But also that comes from a tradition of sort of academic economists also being pretty key to economic policy agencies. And so in my view, at least in the US, it will work better if the metrics are just part and parcel of what we measure, as opposed to being in new dashboards. And I also, I mean, I don't want to say I'm skeptical. I think a lot went into it. I was part of the team that collaborated with them. But like the OECD's Better Living Index, it's a great index, but it's sort of separate, right? It's just, so it's very easy for people to use what they're used to using, or to use the new index if they're creative, but it's very easy for people to dismiss the new index if they don't want to use it. So that's just my opinion, which, I'm very welcome to it being challenged, but.
Great, Carol. So the last two questions, and I'll give them to you together, and that way we can try to finish on time. 10 minutes later, but
Sorry.
no problem. All right, so Sandhu Kojakaru, do you see links between the research program related to hope and agency, such as in Sen's capability approach? Is agency or lack thereof a key path between hope and well-being? That's the first question. And Mariana Rojas asks about the major differences between hope and the self-help literature. And maybe you could elaborate.
Okay.
Last two questions, everyone. Thanks.
So thank you, Sandhu. He was my PhD student before he got famous. He's very talented. But yes, very definitely. I think there are linkages. And as I said, sort of what I think makes hope a plausible new dimension, separate dimension of well-being, it's already part of what we think about as well-being, is precisely its properties of agency, right? It isn't just a belief. It really is linked to behaviors that we care a lot about and that matter to people's long-term outcomes. So, there are very natural linkages to Sen's capabilities approach. Maybe it's a little simpler, I would say, than that. I'm no Sen anyway, so, but I think, yes, the answer is very definitely yes. Mariano, the answer to that one is they're very different, I hope. I'm not in the self-help business, nor never will be. I think, yes, if psychiatrists even say that restoring hope is critical to recovery from mental health. So it's kind of naturally a part of the process of people, I wouldn't say they want to help themselves, people that want to help other people recover from any number of things, whether it's cancer or mental illness, or whether it's depressed communities in general. So I think there are components of it that are useful to people in the self-help business, but I'm still in the academic business of measurement, I suppose, and sort of shy away from it. When I have a lot of media interviews where the journalists ask me if I'm a happy person and do I have any ideas about what makes people happy? I'm like, I don't know. I'm not telling you that. It's just sort of, I personally try and keep the well-being measurement science and academic literature very separate from the self-help literature. There are many people that don't, and I respect what they do, but I just don't I don't want to get in an area that I know nothing about. And I do think it changes the nature of what we're doing in a direction that I personally am not comfortable with.
That's great, Carol. Thank you. You have a couple more thank yous in the chat from Eileen McNeely. And now there are a few coming in as we finish up. Servius Guveriro, Hilke Brockerman, and it'll continue, I think. So thank you very much for your discussion. This has been very helpful, a great way to kick off the series. So again, thank you for starting us off and this enlightening
thank you both Kelsey and Jill for organizing it and sharing it and everything. Really appreciate it. And I do hope it gets us started on an interesting series. Mariano, we should ask Mariano to do one. We want past and current presidents to participate in these. So
I should also say thank you for the work that you're doing. It's not just the academic work, the reference to academic versus self-help, but you're also working with agencies in the US, government agencies, other universities. So there's a lot you should be thanked for. So but thanks. We'll talk about that more in the future. Yeah. So
thank you, Kelsey, and thanks, Jill.
Yeah. Thank you very much, everyone. I guess we'll shut it down now. And as Jill mentioned, there will be an email going out afterwards with a recording of the event, and it will go up on the YouTube channel as well. So we can close it now, though. Thank you again.
Thanks,
Thank you
guys.
so much, Carol. Thank you, everyone, for participating.